I want to request how to celebrate women's empowerment in this country through self-help groups. I want to invite Aloysius Fernandez, dearly called Al, to tell us and give us the wisdom, all his experience, and guiding all of us through this journey. Give us few pointers as to what we can do as civil society organizations in this country. Thank you for coming at a very short notice. Thank you very much, Al. Let me welcome you once again from the bottom of my heart.
I must start by thanking Ved and his team and his group for giving me this opportunity, mainly for interacting with people whom I met years and years ago. They were young then and they are young now, but I learned from them. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank them. So that's the main reason I want to thank you. By seeing these faces, I feel you have added 2 years to my life. My life has been a life of learning. In fact, a few years ago, I wrote this book, 50 years of learning. I have sold enough copies to meet my costs. So if you haven't got a copy, I'll mail you one. Just send me your mail. And I continue learning through this session. I started learning in the 1970s. Of course, before that, I had some degrees from some colleges, but I really started learning in 1971 and throughout the 70s, I was exposed to several disaster situations. The Bangladesh war, the Maharashtra drought, the Ramnath drought. And it is these disasters, man-made and natural-made, which bring out the best and the worst in humanity, which taught me a lot. I relearned. In fact, they removed a lot of baggage that I had on my back, which I had accumulated from my family, my training, my education, my degrees. They de-schooled me. And what did I learn briefly? I learned one, that people had strengths. If they could survive in disasters, and then when I spoke to them, I discovered they had survived in many more before that. They must have strengths. If they've survived in a situation of scarce resources, they must be good managers. And two, that people helped one another in these situations, irrespective of caste or creed. The refugee operation 71, it was the Hindus in Bangladesh who welcomed the Muslims who came from Pakistan. Now in the 80s, so then in the 70s, I said, fine, let me not give people a fish to eat, but teach them to fish. So I was very busy training people in skills of various types. But in the 80s, I learned something more. I discovered that it was not enough to teach people to fish because they could not reach the river. After teaching them to fish, there were several other obstacles coming from power groups arising from politics, caste, the whole feudal society in the rural area that I was working in. And then when they reached the river, they found that the rights of fishing had already been captured by the richer people. So it was just not enough to teach them to fish. They had to find some way to reach the river. They couldn't do it alone. Neither could they do it in a motley group of people who just protested. They had to do it in a systematic way through their own institutions and find perhaps another way to the river if they couldn't overcome the obstacles. So with these learnings that I learned of the 70s and 80s, they opened my life and my eyes to really what was happening in the rural area after I came to join my RADA in 1982. That is the year Pradhan was formed. Now, when I came, I knew that government had put in place two institutions: the Panchayati Raj, which was for governance, and the cooperatives, which were for development. All of this we studied as youngsters. Now, so we started in my RADA working with the cooperatives. We found that we worked with the primary agricultural credit cooperatives. We found that the cooperatives were not helping the poor. We were supporting them. And let me give you a few examples. That's the best. When I lived in the villages, we worked with the primary agricultural credit cooperatives. But I found that the cooperatives, instead of helping the poor, were really being used to exploit them. And I learned this not from classrooms, but sitting in the liquor shop in a village called Huttur. Some of the poorer people from the cooperatives told me, sir, we can't, the president and secretary of the society take loans from the cooperative at 7 to 8% and on lend to us at 30 and 40%. So I said, oh. And secondly, they said, and then if they lend to us, we have to work on their fields. And there were several other examples like this, which meant to me, coming from a background of the Canadian government where cooperatives were really very successful, and I said, well, something is wrong here. And I worked with Amul also, very successful, but I'll come to that difference later, why Amul was successful and why the primary agricultural credit societies were not successful in helping the small man, whereas Amul did. So I said, we have to do something about this. And we began talking to the people, and they came to us in small groups and refused to return the money to the cooperative society. So what we saw was, and after discussing with them, we said, well, why don't you return your loans that you took from the cooperative to yourself? And that is how this whole credit management group started. We called them credit management groups at that time. They did not start as financial intermediaries. They started as opposition groups to the primary agricultural credit societies, which were dominated by the powerful people of the village. This I have to make clear. But since credit was an important tool and finance was an important tool, and it was precisely their dependence, their need for finance, which made them dependent on the rich and powerful, we said, let us try to cope and meet this need for finance. But having realized that people have strengths, we did not give them money. We said, well, why don't you come together and why don't you bring some money that you have to return to the cooperative every week as your recovery? We'll make it into savings. And that is how it started, that they brought some money back to the group. And we then did not take this money, but we opened an account in the bank in the name of Association of Persons and put the money in the bank. And that was the beginning of how this whole sort of group started. There are 10 features which I think are important, which to cut a long story short, I will just mention to you. These were the features which were based on the strengths, local strengths of people. Fine. First, they emerged, the self-help groups emerged in 84, 85, when our primary agricultural societies, in a way, created problems, as I explained to you. Now, each self-help group self-selected its members. And we later realized they self-selected them on the basis of relationships of affinity. Now, these relationships of affinity were really relationships of mutual trust and mutual support. And I want to say that this strength has existed in India's traditional society. It is a strength that we have really not built upon. People have survived because of this strength. And the self-help group movement just built on this strength. And because it wanted these groups to take up other responsibilities, we had to invest in institutional capacity building, namely how to build up these groups as institutions. And therefore, we went into what we call training, which is institutional capacity building, on 24 modules of how to train the self-help groups in institutional capacity building, how to meet, how to talk, how to discuss, how to analyze their problems, how to ensure that they record the decisions. Somebody else did it, but they had to ensure that it was done. How to impose sanctions on people for misbehavior, and a whole list of things which are necessary to build institutions. The third thing is we suggested that they started, as I said, by regular savings, because this was the beginning of self-help. If they had to depend on the richer people for urgent money, for urgent loans, they would always be dependent. So we said, why don't you start by savings, which we put in a bank? Now, this savings went on for 6 months at least, and we gave them some training on how to meet, how to discuss. When one fine day they said they wanted some money, because I still remember one woman said her daughter has to go to the hospital because she's not well, so she wanted some money. So I said, why don't you ask the group for a loan? And she did that, and she got a loan to take her daughter to the hospital. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the focus was on self-help, self-reliance, especially in credit, because it was the dependence for credit which made them subservient. Now, the loans were given from their savings, which we put in a group common fund. And when we saw that they were meeting regularly, we were able to match their savings. That means Mairada put some money in their savings so that they had more money and they could use. What we also discovered was that when they lent this money to this woman, they said, okay, you take 400 rupees, and after 3 months, you return 405 rupees. So they had added a little bit. It wasn't an interest. It was just a kind of a bonus, which they... Now, the next feature of the self-help groups is that the common fund was totally in their control. It comprised their savings, it comprised grants from Mairada, it comprised a few other things, their fines that they had levied because people didn't come on time or did not follow the rules and regulations, whether they were absent. So this was the common fund. Now, when Mairada gave this grant to the group on lent to individuals, but Mairada did not give the grant based on the projects and the loans. It gave the grant to the group as an institution. It assessed whether they were saving regularly, whether they were meeting regularly, whether the groups had their rules and regulations, which we helped them to draft. And it was on these institutional indicators that we gave a grant. The decision to lend to individuals was taken entirely by the SAGs or by the CMGs. Now, what is important to remember is that these self-help groups, they were originally called credit management groups, set their own agenda. Myrada didn't tell them to do watersheds or to do livelihoods. The agenda was set by them. By every meeting, they set their own agenda, and they were gradually trained to implement what was their priorities. Now, if they invested in agriculture, Myrada helped them to use agriculture. If they invested in animal husbandry, we provided technology. If they invested in small-scale industries, we helped them to manage them. That was what we did out of our grants. But the choice of livelihood was theirs. Now, somewhere around 86, I said, now this is looking good. So why can't we sort of go to scale on this? Now here comes the point Narendra raised. I realized that NGOs can do some innovation. But if we want to go to scale, we must get government involved. If you don't get government involved, we will continue to do good work, but it just can't go to scale. And secondly, if you want to go to scale, don't try to take the credit for yourself. Let everybody get involved. Get as many people as involved. Let us not make a name that we have. And in fact, for years, I never said, and I never gave the history of the self-help group because I wasn't interested in telling you how they started. And NABARD took ownership of this program. And that's the great thing. Now, fortunately, as I said, it was good luck. Shri P.R. Naik, who was our development commissioner in Karnataka, became the chairman of NABARD. And he was also the deputy governor of the Reserve Bank. That was an additional bonus. So I went to him in 1986, and said, sir, we have something going. Why don't you help us? He said, well, what do you want? I said, I want 3 million rupees. He said, for what? I said, first, to match the savings of the self-help groups. And secondly, to train them. But he was very sharp. He sent somebody, one of his officers, to one of our self-help groups. And to my bad luck, that officer went at a meeting where one of the members was asked for a loan of 4,000 rupees to set up a small shop to serve idli, vada, and dosa in a cattle mela, which lasts for 20 days. There was a big cattle mela, cattle were brought, a cattle fair. So when she went to the money lender for 4,000, he said, I'll give you 4, you return 5.5. She went to the self-help group. They said, we'll give you 4, you return 4,200 rupees. Now, so she took the loan from the group. But my friend from NABARD calculated, she's taking a loan of 4,000, the interest is 200 for 20 days, and extrapolated it to 365 days and got some exorbitant rate of interest. So P.R. Naik was very angry with me. And I had to explain to him that the interest went to the group. It didn't go to Myrada. And secondly, I said it is a criminal to really annualize interest rates when your activities, most of our activities don't last for a year. They last for a day, they last for 2 days or 20 days. Why do you annualize interest rates? Anyhow, so out of 3 million, he gave me 1 million. And that helped a lot. That money came in 1987. Now, between 87 and 2000 and 1992, when the SAG bank linkage started, there are a lot of things happened, but they are not being shared because they are buried in NABARD and RBI and fortunately in Myrada documents. So all the studies really start with what happened after 92 or after 2000. But between 87, when we got that 1 million, and 92, when it became official, when SAG Bank became official, a lot of work was done. Meetings were held. We had tremendous cooperation from Dr. Rangarajan, who was deputy governor of RBI at that time. We had tremendous cooperation from P.R. Naik, who was the leader in this whole movement. And following him from Mr. Koteya, who was the chairman of NABARD, and then Nanda. And we had a tremendous cooperation from Subhash Wadhwa, who was the CGM, Chief General Manager of NABARD for Karnataka. He worked so closely with all the groups and the banks, especially to convince them. The major problem at that time was two. One, the banks were reluctant to give a bulk loan to the group. They've always been accustomed to giving individual loans. And here we were asking them to give a bulk loan and let the group decide, because it's impossible for them to decide. That was very difficult. And I remember Nanda and Subhash Wadhwa did, Nanda from NABARD, who was chairman, and before him, Wadhwa in the 90s, 1990s, Subhash Wadhwa was a CGM in Bangalore. He went out of his way to persuade the banks to give a bulk loan. In fact, at one of the meetings, he told them, bankers, give a loan, and I guarantee your loan with my provident fund and with my gratuity. He even said that. Now, that is how this movement took off. And then what happened to our good luck? Because we started, IFAD, International Fund for Agricultural Development, started a project in Tamil Nadu, and they were in touch with me and with NABARD. They introduced the self-help group in the project in Tamil Nadu. And now they had to get a banker who would agree to give loans directly to the group. And they found the chairman of the Indian Bank who said, yes, I'll do that. Now, these were the people who took this step, the steps that really helped us to launch the self-help group SAG Bank Linkage Program. So ultimately, there were three major policy decisions and that were made by RBI and NABARD, which have not been made by any organization in the world. First, they said, we don't need another bank like the Grameen Bank to lend to small people. We have been doing this for years. Small loans have been given to people for years. So we don't need another bank. We have the RRBs, we have the cooperatives. Secondly, they said, but we need to change because the formal sector, the banks are run in the formal sector by formal systems. They are not in sync with the informal sector. The informal sector, the cash flow is completely different. The risks are completely different. So we need to adjust. The variety, the diversity is completely different in the informal sector. And they took three decisions, which I must congratulate our policymakers for. One, they said, allow the groups, give a bulk loan to the group. And let the group decide after it has been trained, after it has saved, after it has lent internally and proved that it can do all this. If they prove they can lend money and return their own money, then the bank should give a loan to the group. But give it as a bulk. Do not try to break down into individual loans. And it worked because the studies were made by NABARD, and it was found, the banks found it much cheaper to do this, to assess the group as an institution, to visit the group once, and then to give a bulk loan. And what was more important is, because the group was fully in charge of the loan, it was the group that took the money back to the bank. One of the members of the self-help groups visited the bank every week to return money, or every 2 weeks to return money. It wasn't the bank which had to go to the self-help group. Today, the MFIs send their staff to the self-help groups. Those days, the self-help groups went to the bank. And this built the relationship between the bank and the poor people. And when we made a survey and asked the people, what did you benefit? First, of course, they said easy credit. Secondly, they said respect from the bankers. And what we saw is after a year or two of saving in the self-help group, many of our self-help group members opened accounts and saved in the bank. So there was financial inclusion for you at their age when they were confident that they were able to do it. So the first state that incorporated self-help groups was Tamil Nadu. And of course, from there it went to Maharashtra and to all over the, and thanks to IFAD, which incorporated it in Karnataka and elsewhere. But the first loan to a bulk loan to the group was given by Ramesh Gelli of Vaishya Bank on September 13, 1991. And that was, the RBI had expressed willingness earlier that the bulk loan could be given, but the actual first loan was given by Vaishya Bank really. And as I said, the first state to incorporate it in a massive scale was Tamil Nadu, and the first bank to take it on a state level was the Indian Bank. So these were the people who I think were responsible for really putting the whole thing together. And that is what Dr. Rangarajan said. The self-help group movement was the largest cooperative endeavor on microfinance in the world. There were thousands of bank branches involved, the cooperatives were involved, thousands of NGOs were involved, and it was a cooperative endeavor, and that is why it spread, and you have so many people today. They had several good reasons, I think, for supporting this, because they were not happy with the IRDP. But the point I would like to make is this: the self-help group is not something that is a solution for everything. The self-help group was a transition strategy. It was a transition strategy which enabled and allowed the informal sector to link up with the formal sector. That is our major problem. Very often, the formal sector takes decisions and the informal sector really cannot live with them. So what the formal sector therefore had to make those three policy decisions: to give a bulk loan to the group. The second policy decision was to give a loan to an unregistered group. That was a very difficult decision to take, and Dr. Rangarajan supported it. And the third was to give a loan without security. Now, these were three major policy decisions. The first, as I said, was to give to an unregistered group. The law department was very much against it. But my position was that they are association of persons, and the self-help groups are keeping records and accounts. And Dr. Rangarajan said if they are doing that, the bank should give a loan to them, even if they are registered. I conducted a survey among self-help groups, and they said, for God's sake, don't register us formally, because if we are registered, we will be harassed by some petty government officer. And Dr. Rangarajan understood this. He said, follow the rules. I asked them, in fact, you have so many registered cooperative societies, are they working well? They all kept quiet. Now, here is a group working well. It's an association of persons. Work with them, for God's sake. And I must say, Rangarajan and PR and I can all supported this decision. So these were the three decisions taken by the official system to enable the unofficial informal group to really merge with it, with the ultimate objective that the people in the rural area will relate with the banks. So it was a transition for the informal sector members to get into the banks. And the transition therefore allowed them to be flexible. It did not say IRDP is for goats and sheep and this. They could lend for anything. All the banks said, we want our money back. And the recovery was 99%. So so we must understand this. Why I'm saying this is because if we are trying to, the self-help groups really brought into inclusion, not just into financial inclusion, but what I call into inclusion and growth. It's not enough to bring into financial inclusion. You have to bring people into the growth, to include them in the growth process. And that was done by the NGOs who supported the groups. So the other point I'd like to add is, because it brought so many institutions into the picture, it brought NABARD, it brought the banks, and it brought the Women's Development Corporation. In all the states, the Women's Development Corporation were in charge of these programs, and it was supported by IFAD, International Fund for Agricultural Development. And the Women's Development Corporation brought this dimension of women's empowerment. You know, when we started in 86, 85 in Mairada, we had men's groups, we had mixed groups, and we had women's groups. But then we found that the men were not serious because in the evening they had other places to go to, never came for a self-help group meeting. And the mixed groups functioned very well because in a mixed group, the women always, when together, they really got an upper hand. But that men also dropped out. Then the women's group survived, and the government gave it to the Women's Development Corporation. So they really spread. Mairada also realized very important thing. When in the men's groups, when the men earned some money, they did not take this money home. They used it to buy a new angavastram or some new or smoke from BD to cigarette. But when the women earned some money, they used it for the family. And it was not easy. I must tell you that when the women's groups we promoted, we started in Thalawadi, really, where Pradhan had one first retreat, if you remember.
I remember it.
Yeah. What happened was that men really did not like women to meet alone. They dragged them out by their hair. They threw stones on the roof. They set fire to the hay on the roof. But it gradually subsided because the women held together. And then the money started coming in. So men saw that it was useful to send women to the meeting. So empowerment took place like that. So to come back to my point that self-help groups were a transition phase. Now, I always said they will evolve into something more. They can evolve, but it has given the poor people a certain sense of confidence, a certain level of independence, so that in other institutions, they can stand on their feet. Now, it's important because when we started working with the sex workers, the sex workers' priority was health and freedom from oppression from pimps and police. So we formed Saukya groups which focused on health. They, of course, went into credit later, but they had no problem with money. They had money, but they had problems of health and oppression. But the group methodology, the group structure was very successful. They formed affinity groups. When we started with Devadasis, their problem was the consecrations of young women, young children, girl child as Devadasis. How to stop it? They had money. So we formed groups to tackle this problem. Now, why I'm saying this is, there are millions of people who have benefited from the self-help group, but there are many more millions who have not benefited from the self-help group. And because of two reasons, many reasons. One is that microfinance has now taken over the whole thing, and I'll not go more into that. But more importantly, the money for training self-help groups and formation has declined considerably. And money is now going into farmer producer organizations. That's fine. I think we have about 70 of them in Mairada, and they are successful because many of the members were self-help group members who are keeping an eye on finance and management in the farmers producer organizations. They're not good at marketing, though. We have to do something about that. So therefore, there are millions of people who are not. The sex workers were not members of self-help groups, so we had to deal with them separately. Devadasis were not. What about migrant labor? We need an approach, a group approach to migrant labor who migrate with their families, and with those who migrate without their families, who leave their families behind. And there are millions of these, and they need they need a focused attention to for institution building. The group approach has to be adopted even for this group. There are a lot of small groups of people who are falling out of the development process. We need to look at them. Development is like an onion. You've got to keep peeling the layers, but we have to keep looking for them. Mairada has done a job. All its self-help group members today are not poor. They are doing well. So, but they are doing excellently in farmer-producer organizations. But are we starting groups for the poorer sectors? Are we redesigning our, are we so stuck with the rules of the self-help groups that we want all the groups to follow them, or are we ready to adjust? For that, we need to be open. For that, we need not just to throw out the baggage of the past, but also to throw out the baggage of the self-help groups and understand that there are several other groups open. Now, how are we going to get funds to support and train these groups? That's a big problem. We need to do that. I think we can start trying to do that. But we must first find these groups. So my request to everybody is, go out today. Our major job is to find groups that have slipped out of the development process. They may be receiving money in direct benefit, but they are not part of the growth process. How do we bring them into the growth process? It's becoming more and more difficult, I think, to get them into the growth process because you need to be far more equipped digitally to get into it today. So how do we get into this? So these are the challenges, I think, for the future. We need to throw out the past baggage, which I accumulated in my education, which I got de-schooled during the 70s, during the disasters. Then I accumulated again with the self-help groups. We need to really throw all this baggage out and go back to the roots, go back to the basics, to using the group formation, the group ideology, the group and the networking of groups. Today, what has happened in Mairada? I can only tell you that the self-help groups have amalgamated into community managed resource centers, about 80 to 100 of them. They are community managed resource centers. And Mairada, we had sub offices in our projects. We have handed over these offices to them. They are now running it. They charge for all the services. They charge the self-help groups for all the services they render to them. They audit their books, they charge for it. They give them information on several schemes. They try to get them loans, they charge for them. So the community managed resource centers are today independent financially in Mairada. One of them, in fact, is even running a radio station, you'll be surprised, called Namadwani. It is the only community managed radio station in the country. And the government is now, and it was used extensively in COVID, where government officers came and really broadcasted how to avoid, to take preventive measures for COVID. So institutions like Mairada and all of us have to move on with new specs, new glasses, and new insights into several groups, which I think have not had the benefit of self-help groups. They need to be brought in, and we need to find how the group approach can be adapted to them.